I'm Paul Gross. I beat the often path by working on climate tech hardware and specifically a device that captures the carbon emissions straight from the tailpipe of a semi truck. We capture about 80% of the truck's CO2, sell it, and share the revenue with trucking companies. So the device pays for itself and we help them reduce their carbon emissions.
Welcome back to the Beat the Often Path podcast. I'm your host, Ross Palmer. On this show, we shine a spotlight on people who are actually solving the problems that face us to give us better templates for how we can live our lives in these crazy times. Joining me today is Paul Gross, the CEO, the co-CEO, and co-founder of Remora, a startup that captures carbon emissions directly from semi-trucks as they drive. This tech, called a mobile carbon capture system, is the first of its kind to be commercialized anywhere in the world. Remora's system can be retrofitted onto existing diesel trucks, capturing and storing their carbon. And this is a big deal, folks, because there are over 2 million semis in the US on the road right now alone. So they've raised millions in funding, and they're already working with major brands to help reduce total carbon emissions globally. Paul himself was listed to Forbes 30 Under 30, and he has an inspiring story for us all. So here's Paul Gross of Remora. Well, welcome to the show, Paul. It's really great to have you here, but you're a little bit too late because trucks are going to be electrified, so there's no need for your solution. I've looked at your website, and it's official. So why even bother?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that we've seen, so my co-founder, Christina, created the EPA's Advanced Test Program for electric vehicles. My co-founder, Eric, built electric buses and trucks before this. So we totally see the value of electrification. I think it can be a great solution for some sectors like cars, smaller trucks. The problem is batteries are incredibly heavy, and when it comes to hauling big loads long distances, it's really, really hard to electrify those types of vehicles. So that's why, we're a lot less likely to see electric cargo ships or electric airplanes. And similarly for electric trucks, they're great for these shorter routes, but for the long haul, heavy duty routes across the country, you're talking about cutting a third to half of the entire truck's payload capacity just by putting all those batteries on board. And that's really not something we can do when 70% of all goods in the US are on a semi truck at some point in their lifetime.
A third to a half? How heavy are we talking about here?
Yeah, so for electrifying about 500 miles of travel on a semi truck, we're talking about 10 tons of batteries. So it's a really significant number. And then that just grows if you're trying to really replicate the range of a diesel semi-truck, which is thousands of miles. You'd be maxing out the entire truck's payload capacity just with batteries.
So is that feasible at all? Is there any reason to pursue that? Because I know some people are.
Absolutely. We should be pursuing every possible way to decarbonize semi-trucks. It's one of the largest sectors of emissions in the US. I mean, transportation is the largest, and then within that, semi-trucks have an outsized share. And we should be looking at all different types of solutions: electrification, hydrogen, alternative fuels, and carbon capture. We just think carbon capture is going to be the best solution, but we would love to see other solutions be tried as well. And I think, for semi-trucks, but for a lot of other sectors of the economy as well, we need to get out of the kind of silver bullet mentality and get into the kind of just all of the above, just trying different things mentality, where I bet, if you look at the industry 20 years from now, it's successfully decarbonized, we're going to see a lot of different solutions playing a role to get to that end goal. So that's our view, and that's why we're so focused on mobile carbon capture.
Well, that makes sense. And to your point, I think not a lot of people are aware of the sheer variety of solutions that are being worked on by smart people such as yourself. And I certainly wasn't before I started doing this show, but 130 some interviews later, I've gotten to learn about a lot of the different solutions. And what strikes me is that at this point, I've heard many, many wildly different answers to how we can draw down carbon or how we can sequester carbon. All of them plausible and interesting in their own way, all of them approaching the problem from a different angle, and quite frankly, stuff that I had no idea was out there. I had no clue. I mean, all these industries are bad. We know that shipping is bad. We know that trucks are bad. We know that transportation is bad. We know that there are so many different facets of our life that are bad. And we also know that carbon capture is one of the most important things that we can possibly do. But this represents a new method and a new mechanism that we haven't covered yet on this show. And I think it's ultra fascinating. So Describe to us how you came about learning to approach the problem from this angle. Why did you figure out that this was the place you wanted to dive in here?
I looked at all of the different climate technologies that had successfully scaled. And I think the key sort of commonality between wind, solar panels, batteries is that they're all modular, repeatable technologies that can be manufactured. So as we manufacture more and more of something, it gets cheaper and cheaper. And I think one of the things that to notice is the US is really, really good at manufacturing, but really, really bad at construction or big kind of one-time projects. Everything is over budget and years behind. And what I saw is carbon capture, as you said, is a super important piece of the puzzle. Every UN report talks about how important carbon capture is going to be. But our
Absolutely.
only approach to carbon capture was in the construction bucket, where we were retrofitting these one-off industrial facilities. It would take years of planning. Budgets would be overrun. It'd be lots of capital expenditure up front. And we weren't taking carbon capture and putting it into a kind of modular, repeatable form factor that has been so successful for other climate technologies. So my initial question was, how can we make carbon capture modular and repeatable? And that's how I came onto this idea of mobile carbon capture on a semi-truck.
Okay. Well, in the video on your website, you described yourself as coming from a hippie school. You said you had a hippie roots, and then you learned about climate change in general. Is that something you took with you? I mean, has that really been the case ever since you learned about greenhouse gases? You've been just jonesing for a way to solve this?
Yeah, I think it's always been something that kind of weighed on me. I did go to quite a hippie school. We did huge units on. Yeah, I grew up in San Francisco.
Right.
We did units on how to compost appropriately and how to recycle, and we had singing time every day. It was something. It was just taken for granted that caring for our planet and really, really taking climate change seriously is something that everyone needed to do. Earth Day was like the biggest celebration of the year at my school, and
nice.
I think that just really stuck with me and almost was this kind of starting assumption that whatever I did would need to have some interaction with climate change, because this is, like it or not, a problem that's just getting worse, and it's going to affect all of our lives, and it's going to dramatically change our way of life if we're not able to do something really rapidly in the next couple decades.
I completely agree. I grew up in the exact opposite environment in the middle of America where it's like, Earth Day, shut up. What are you talking about, Earth Day? If one person had a flag with a picture of the Earth on it, it'd get yelled at. That violates the HOA rules. But it's good that you had that background and you took it seriously and you took it with you and that you actually did something about it, the step that so few people do. So that's nice. Now, question, on your website, you say that a truck driving this modular, manufacturable, repeatable, scalable tech that you have created, which looks super cool, will be the equivalent of planting 6,500 trees per year, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
So why do this instead of just planting 6,500 trees per year, if we're going to make that kind of comparison?
It's a great question. So I think the really important difference is we need to look at what ends up happening to that carbon dioxide. So first of all, we're being, I think, pretty generous to trees in the sense that we're looking at we're looking at mature trees. So after a tree has been growing for 10 years, it captures about 50 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. Obviously, on average, depends on the exact tree. But so we're making the comparison after the tree's been alive for a while. I think the other thing to say is if that tree decomposes, releases the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. If the tree burns down, it releases the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So there's much more of a cyclic process there, where often the carbon dioxide that's temporarily captured by the tree goes back into circulation. I think by comparison, when we capture carbon dioxide, we take that carbon dioxide and we sequester it permanently, either in an EPA certified well underground, where it eventually turns back into rock, or by pumping it into, for instance, concrete, where it gets basically turns into calcium carbonate and gets permanently sequestered. So either way, the carbon dioxide that we're capturing it gets taken out of circulation forever so that it never goes back into the atmosphere. And that's a really important difference.
Makes sense. And the process that you described, so it's basically a modular thing that attaches to the back of a semi-truck, or the cab of a truck, I guess you would say. And the idea is that while the trucker is filling up for gas, they're also offloading their carbon at the same time. So you're filling it with gas, you're offloading the carbon. And is there a mechanism in place for that to happen, or is that something that has to be installed at gas stations for this to work at scale?
Yeah, so that's something that we're installing first at our customers' distribution centers and then at truck stops as we grow. We've already installed a bunch of CO2 offload tanks at our initial pilot partners' distribution centers. These are literally off-the-shelf carbon dioxide tanks. We just buy them, put them on the ground, hook them up to electrical, and they're ready to go. It's a very low lift. And they're also literally 10 times cheaper than an electric charging station. They don't require any of the grid upgrades or anything else. So it's a pretty straightforward piece of equipment to install. And as you say, the offloading process is dead simple. The driver just pulls up to one of these tanks, hooks a hose to the side of the device pumps the CO2 out into the tank, and then the driver detaches the hose. They don't have to take anything off the truck or put anything new on the truck. And the whole process just takes 15 minutes. So it's faster than refueling a semi-truck. And as we grow, we'll be installing these tanks at truck stops so that folks can offload, while they're on a cross-country route and not just at the end of their round trip at the distribution center.
That makes sense. And you mentioned concrete manufacture, which for those who've been paying attention, concrete is an enormously wasteful process. It's also one of the scariest parts of our modern world, if I'm not mistaken, because it takes a number of resources that are scarce. So what role does carbon dioxide play in creating concrete? How does it make that part of things better?
There are a number of really cool new companies working on using carbon dioxide to cure concrete or in various parts of the concrete production process. The curing part is pretty simple. The concrete is baked in these essentially big ovens, to really oversimplify. And if you inject the carbon dioxide into that oven during the curing process, the concrete actually uptakes the carbon dioxide. So the CO2 turns into calcium carbonate and becomes part of the concrete. And the reason that's good is it makes the concrete stronger. And in some cases, it also makes the concrete cheaper because you're using less Portland cement, which is an expensive ingredient in concrete. That means you get this stronger, cheaper concrete that's also sequestering carbon dioxide. That's the kind of product that I think everyone should be really excited about. And there are a lot of great companies working on it. So for us, we're not developing that technology. We just take our CO2 and sell it to the concrete producers that are already using that technology.
That's super cool. Okay, so we've got this really interesting process. I also love about your story that you have this cool co-founder story, because you have two co-founders, right? In addition to yourself.
That's right.
So it's often been said that it's better in Silicon Valley and in the startup land to have a co-founder. You have a couple. And when I see your story of how you met your co-founder, it seems really interesting. Also because you seem to have complementary skill sets. They often say that one co-founder should be more of the salesperson, the other one should be more of a technical co-founder. Do you think that you followed the playbook in that sense, or how has it been with you in getting a co-founder to do this?
Yeah. So first of all, the way that I met my co-founder, Christina, is that I got, as I mentioned, really into this idea of mobile carbon capture, and then just tried to understand why no one was doing it. So I did a lot of my own research, and I came across her PhD dissertation online, which was literally on mobile carbon capture. She was, in academia, everyone had dismissed this idea, and she was saying, actually, I think this would work. She got funding from the EPA to test out that idea, and was able to prove the beginnings of, hey, this is possible. So I just reached out to her to ask her some questions about her research. I did not think we would be starting a company together, but we hit it off. I wrote her a business plan, and we ended up deciding to start the company. But we knew we needed a third co-founder. I think really for the reasons you're saying, which is we wanted to make sure that the key skill sets for the company were all represented in the founding team. And she had this background in mobile carbon capture, but she didn't have the background in prototyping early technologies or mechanical engineering. And so we did this big search and found our other co-founder, Eric, who is this just genius mechanical engineer. He was literally a diesel semi-truck mechanic for the first part of
Wow.
his career. Then he got his bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering. He ended up building electric and hydrogen buses and trucks. So a bunch of first generation, super cool new technologies. And, without his contribution, it would be impossible to get something like this on the road. You need that kind of brilliance and expertise in bringing new technologies into the world. The three of us teamed up, and that's how we started the company.
Very cool. Do you consider yourself to be more of the salesperson in this endeavor, or what role do you see yourself as playing of the three?
My role is to do everything that's not engineering. So,
Okay.
my goal is to allow these brilliant engineers who are my
Yes.
co-founders to spend all their time building this amazing new technology, and then I go and do sales, finance, operations, fundraising, legal, just everything else to support them.
So they can just work on what they need to work on. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's super cool. Well, one of the things that struck me, I mean, we've talked about the importance of travel on this show and how it's a theme that's come up over and over again, traveling to foreign countries, living in foreign countries. And in the beginning, it was just a theory that I had or a hypothesis, but it's really blossomed into a pattern that I've seen over and over again about global travel as being the catalyst or the spark for a lot of these crazy ideas. And I love that your co-founder, in sharing her story, she said, I moved to Germany when I was
Yeah.
younger. And in Germany, I realized that, we can live in a way that uses much, much, much less plastic. There's a way of living that is fundamentally different from the single-use throwaway culture that's prevalent in the United States. And then she took
Yeah.
that idea back, and that was the impetus for her beginning this kind of work, which I just find to be endlessly fascinating. Have you ever talked about the importance of travel with her or with other parts of your team?
Yeah, I think that's a commonality actually for all three co-founders of the company.
Cool.
So Christina has this really powerful experience moving to Germany. I spent all of high school saving up money to take a year off between high school and college, just traveling by myself, and I found that to be a really impactful year. Both just in terms of all the other different ways of living that I encountered, but also just in terms of my kind of connecting with the environment and with the planet. And similarly, Eric has traveled a lot. He grew up outside of the U.S. and then, since then he's just traveled the world quite a bit. And I do think that's really important. It's, growing up in San Francisco, I know what it's like to be in a environment where there's a bunch of shared values and shared assumptions about the world, and to get outside of that and to learn about sort of different ways of living and different ways of approaching problems, I think is incredibly valuable.
So that's fascinating. I didn't know that that was true for you. Where did you travel, by the way? Where did you go in your gap year?
So the highlight of my gap year was that I biked across the United States from East Coast to West Coast just by
Cool.
myself.
Amazing.
And that was an amazing way to, first of all, just meet people all across the country, but also to experience the incredible natural beauty of the United States and to really be immersed in these massive landscapes that otherwise I just would never have seen or really connected with in the same way. It's not the same to just zip through in a car.
Oh. How long did that take you? How many weeks or months?
It took 2 months.
2 months. Okay. And literally just by yourself, no support vehicle, nothing, just tent, biking with all your
By
stuff?
myself. The tent and everything else was
Get out of
was
here.
attached to the back of my bike. It was not. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it. I was at one point biking through the Rockies, like caked in snow. So there were some moments that weren't ideal, but it was an amazing experience.
How cool is that? So it's perspective, a theme that's come up over and over again. Perspective on the world, different ways of living, challenging the assumptions that you've always had. This is the essence. So you had an inkling of an idea. You said, why don't we capture this at the source? And you discovered that one of the greatest sources is, of course, the trucking industry, because, as you mentioned at the beginning, such a large percentage of our life as it exists here is powered by semi-trucks, for better or for worse. And the trucking industry is responsible for most of what happens, especially in these types of large countries that you biked from end to end of, where there's just giant land mass without water or ports. So the United States in particular is a great example of where trucking is very, very necessary, because there's no real alternative that I can think of to trucking. And as you said, electric vehicles are a solution, but they're far away. And I think you said something on your website like, we need a solution now. So does this represent, in your opinion, a solution that works now? Is it functional? Is it doing what you hoped it would do at this point, or is there room for growth?
Yeah, this is a solution that works now. And I think that is one of the really appealing parts of this. We're not waiting for 5 more scientific breakthroughs or another couple decades of basic research. This is this is technology that we can deploy on our customers' trucks in the next year. And it's a technology that we need now because we're spewing millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the air every year. And that is why we're seeing these worsening hurricanes and worsening wildfires. It's something that we need to counter now. We can't afford to wait for the perfect solution that's maybe a couple decades away. To me, that's one of the really crucial reasons to start pursuing solutions like mobile carbon capture that are ready to go.
Well, one of the great tensions that we explore on this show and in general is the tension between activism or environmentalism and whatever corporations are doing. We know, generally speaking, we tend to have a lot of fear or negativity, especially those of us from a certain point of view, let's just say, tend to view corporations as being largely responsible for a lot of the things, or let's say not doing their fair share in general of helping solve these problems, especially the ones that we all know and love. But one thing that struck me about your messaging is that you said that the trucking industry is actually very open and receptive to these kinds of ideas, which I think probably a lot of people might feel would not be the case. So how has your journey been in terms of getting them to accept this as an idea?
We have been greeted by the trucking industry with open arms. I have to speak from my experience. I think a lot of people have a lot of assumptions about the trucking industry. But what I've seen is that every single company we've talked to, or almost every single one, is saying, we have been searching for ways to decarbonize our trucks. We really, really want to reduce our carbon emissions. We know we're having a big impact on the environment. We don't have a way to do it. We don't have a technology that's going to work. And that's why they're so excited about mobile carbon capture, because they see that this is something that could actually work. If you look at the trucking industry just over the last 15 years, the industry has actually tried a bunch of different approaches to reducing carbon emissions. There was a whole wave of, for instance, trying compressed natural gas trucks, which reduce carbon emissions by something like 25%. There has been a lot of experimentation with renewable natural gas and biofuels. And all of those are really awesome approaches. So I think we are seeing a lot of excitement from the trucking industry to reduce their carbon emissions. And, it's just not something you can expect someone to do if you don't have a solution available to do it. The trucking industry's primary responsibility is to make sure that all of the goods that we depend on in our day-to-day lives get to us on time and reliably. And so, they can't do a solution that puts that in jeopardy. But what I've seen is that the trucking industry is incredibly open to trying new technologies and new approaches. And it's been a pleasure, honestly, to work with all of the folks who are really, really trying to reduce their carbon emissions.
That's fabulous. Are there certain areas that are more receptive, like Europeans, for example? Are there areas that are much more ready to go with this, or?
I think what's most interesting is that it doesn't break down cleanly by geography or really by anything else. In my view, it's just about individual people within these companies deciding that this is a priority and doing it. I think we have this narrative that companies are, just at the whim of their shareholders, that individuals within the companies, there's nothing they can do. They have to maximize shareholder returns in the most narrow possible, short-sighted possible sort of sense of the word. And I think that's not true. I think that really great leaders within companies can just decide, and it's not even a hard decision at this point, that, hey, it's actually going to be in the interest of our shareholders in the medium to long term if we reduce our carbon emissions and have less of an impact on the planet. It's what our customers are demanding. It's what our shareholders are demanding. It's what regulators are demanding. And I think we're increasingly seeing people who own companies or are leaders in companies making that decision. So it isn't really about geography. It's just about those individual decisions that are being made.
You talked about other industries that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to replace with battery or electricity tech, like airplanes, shipping, all of that. Do you think that outfitting those types of vehicles with your tech is something that could conceivably happen in the future? Could an airplane have this?
In most cases, yes. I think I'm gonna say no to airplanes.
Okay.
I think it's even too difficult to add carbon capture to an airplane. The payload issue is so great. But for cargo ships or for locomotives or for other forms of long haul heavy duty transport, I think mobile carbon capture could be a great solution. It's something we're definitely interested in. But also there are now something like 10 different companies working on mobile carbon capture for cargo ships. So the space is growing itself. There are all of these folks that are understanding that mobile carbon capture is going to be a really important piece of the decarbonization puzzle for some of these sectors.
Very cool. So describe for an idiot such as myself, how does the process, broadly speaking, work? What is actually happening? I mean, you're hooking this thing up to the tailpipe. What's going on? Okay.
We hook it up to the tailpipe. The exhaust goes through an exhaust conditioning system, so we make some changes. And then we flow it through an adsorbent bed. And that's the key part of the process. Inside the adsorbent bed, we have little beads. And the beads have tiny microscopic pores where the carbon dioxide molecules physically get stuck. So carbon dioxide molecules get stuck in the pores. All the other gases in the exhaust, like nitrogen and oxygen, are the wrong size, so they don't get stuck in the pores. They flow right through the beads and out into the air. So we get this clean exhaust coming out of the truck. Once the beads are all filled with carbon dioxide, we then regenerate them. So we heat them up using heat from the truck's exhaust. And when they're heated, the pores open up and the carbon dioxide molecules come out. So we get this pure carbon dioxide coming out of the adsorbent bed, and we can compress it and store it on board the truck until it gets offloaded, as we talked about earlier. So that's the whole process. And the really crucial thing is that we have multiple adsorbent beds, so we can be regenerating some of them and capturing new carbon dioxide with other adsorbent beds all at the same time. So we're never in a position where we're not capturing CO2 coming out of the tailpipe. We're always capturing it with one part of the system, even as we regenerate another part of the system. And that's all happening as the truck drives.
Would you like to close us out here, promote something you want to promote, or a parting word of wisdom? You can wrap it up.
I think, I've already said it, but my parting word of wisdom is everyone should push themselves to do something really hard. It's so easy to do the easier thing, but we are in a really challenging moment, both with climate change, but there are also a lot of other big problems. And the solutions to those problems are going to be hard. It's not going to be this kind of easy thing that you can do on the side that's, just it feels good and you're not going to have to, challenge yourself. It's going to be super hard and it's going to be brutal at moments. And it's often going to involve delays or more funding than you think you'll need, or it's going to be really frustrating. But that is so important to push through when you're trying to really have an impact. And I want everyone to know that that's part of the process. And so you should just push through it, and you're going to end up having a really big impact at the other end. So I again, just say, push yourself to do something hard. If you feel like you're not doing something hard enough, you ask, what can I do to make this harder for myself and to increase the impact that I'm having?
Awesome. Great words. Thank you for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure, Paul. I wish you the best of success. And with that, the official podcast is over.